Ford Motor Company was founded in 1903 in Detroit. The firm achieved decisive process innovation in 1913 with the introduction of the moving assembly line at its Highland Park plant. The assembly line cut assembly time and reduced unit cost. It also increased the need for a steady, disciplined workforce. In early mass production, turnover was high and attendance was irregular. In 1914, Ford announced the $5 day. The plan raised base daily pay, reduced working hours, and included eligibility rules that linked the higher rate to conduct and seniority. The $5 day drew national attention. It lowered turnover, stabilized production, and established Ford's reputation for paying above prevailing rates when business conditions allowed. The company described the policy as sound business designed to support output and quality. John and Horace Dodge operated a successful machine shop and foundry in Detroit. They supplied engines, transmissions, and axles to early automobile firms and invested in Ford Motor Company in its first year. The Dodge brothers entered vehicle manufacturing under their own name in 1914. By the mid-1910s, Ford's Model T dominated the American market in sales volume. The company generated large profits. Henry Ford stated publicly that he intended to reduce prices further, expand plant capacity, and employ more workers. To finance expansion and price reductions, he reduced or withheld special dividends to shareholders. The litigation and decision, 1916 to 1919. In 1916, the Dodge brothers, acting as minority shareholders of Ford Motor Company, brought suit in Michigan State Court. They sought to compel the payment of a substantial special dividend and to restrain corporate actions that, in their view, subordinated shareholder returns to other goals. They argued that retained earnings should be distributed to owners instead of being used to fund a price-cutting campaign that could disadvantage competitors, including their own new enterprise. The case reached the Michigan Supreme Court. In 1919, the court ordered Ford Motor Company to pay a large special dividend, amounting to more than $19 million. It declined to enjoin Ford's expansion plans. It did not dictate prices or wages. In its opinion, the court stated that a business corporation is organized and carried on primarily for the profit of its shareholders. This sentence did not change any statute. It did not set compensation schedules. It did, however, provide a concise statement of purpose that became a standard reference in corporate law and business practice. Immediate managerial effects, 1919 to the mid-1920s. The court's decision did not produce an immediate change in wages at Ford Motor Company. The firm continued to use pay and working conditions to stabilize the workforce and protect throughput. In 1919 and 1920, wage adjustments across the economy reflected post-war inflation and strong demand. A sharp recession followed in 1920 to 1921, with widespread reductions in hours and pay. In the early to mid-1920s, wages recovered as the economy expanded. After 1919, the new legal language about corporate purpose was visible in managerial communications. Executives described pay policies as investments that supported productivity, attendance, and product quality. Higher wages were justified as measures that reduced turnover and training costs. Wage restraint was justified as necessary to competitiveness, solvency, and planned expansion. The guiding principle was that wages should serve the long-run profitability and continuity of the enterprise. The 1920s, welfare capitalism and managerial control. In the 1920s, union membership declined in many industries. Large firms adopted programs commonly described as welfare capitalism. These programs included attendance bonuses, profit-sharing formulas, company medical services, savings plans, and recreation facilities. Employers used them to stabilize the workforce while maintaining managerial control over wage setting and work rules. In the automobile industry, hourly rates rose over the decade after the early slump of 1920 to 1921. Ford and other firms increased pay to retain experienced workers and to meet production schedules. The public language of the period emphasized thrift, efficiency, and the alignment of employee and shareholder interests. Executives framed pay policy as an instrument to reduce defects, maintain output, and support orderly operations. They did not present wage increases as independent social obligations detached from business requirements. The managerial rationale followed the shareholder primacy baseline articulated in the 1919 opinion. The early to mid-1930s, depression, labor law, and organizing. The Great Depression changed wage dynamics and labor relations. Industrial output fell sharply after 1929. Employers reduced hours, cut wages, and laid off workers. In 1935, the National Labor Relations Act recognized the right of employees to organize and bargain collectively. It established the National Labor Relations Board to conduct elections and remedy unfair labor practices. The Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938 later set federal minimum wage and overtime standards for covered occupations. In the automobile industry, organizing accelerated. The United Auto Workers held elections and conducted campaigns at General Motors, Chrysler, and Ford. The 1936 to 1937 sit-down strikes at General Motors led to recognition of the union. At Ford, resistance was stronger. The 1937 incident known as the Battle of the Overpass, in which Ford security personnel assaulted union organizers at the River Rouge complex, drew national attention. In 1941, Ford Motor Company recognized the UAW following a strike. A first contract followed. Collective bargaining moved wage setting from unilateral management decisions to formal negotiations. The shareholder primacy principle from the 1919 decision did not disappear. It provided a frame for managerial explanations. Executives accepted wage increases and new procedures when they supported productivity, quality, and labor peace. They resisted measures when they believed costs would compromise competitiveness or solvency. Courts did not set wage levels. They enforced the legal process. The 1940s, wartime controls and post-war adjustment. During World War II, wage growth was constrained by federal controls. The Little Steel formula limited wage increases to a defined percentage. Automakers converted to military production under government contracts. Employment and hours were governed by wartime needs. After the war, firms returned to civilian production and negotiated new contracts under peacetime conditions. In 1945 to 1946, the UAW conducted a major strike at General Motors. The dispute concerned wages and prices. The settlement influenced the pattern of negotiations across the sector. In 1950, General Motors and the UAW negotiated a multi-year agreement often called the Treaty of Detroit. It established a predictable framework for wages, cost of living adjustments, pensions, and health benefits. Ford and Chrysler concluded similar agreements. The pattern stabilized wages and benefits and reduced the incidence of long strikes. These settlements were accepted because they provided labor peace and allowed management to plan investments and model cycles. The corporate purpose baseline remained unchanged. Management presented the costs as predictable and recoverable through productivity, pricing, and market share. Boards retained discretion within the business judgment rule to adopt agreements they believed served the long-run interests of the company. The 1950s and 1960s, productivity sharing and real wage growth. In the 1950s and 1960s, the automotive industry experienced high demand and improved productivity. Unionized workers received regular wage increases, cost of living adjustments, and expanded benefits. Pattern bargaining transmitted gains across the major firms. Real earnings for auto workers rose, and a stable middle-income class emerged in manufacturing regions. The logic of the period was straightforward. High volume and standardized production allowed companies to share productivity gains with employees while maintaining profits and reinvestment. Management described wage settlements as instruments to maintain quality, reduce labor disputes, and protect the reputation of the firm. Courts maintained a neutral stance on wage levels. They ensured compliance with labor law and contract enforcement. The 1970s, oil shocks, inflation, and wage restraint. The 1970s presented new constraints on wage policy. Oil price shocks in 1973 to 1974 and 1979, high inflation, and increased competition from foreign automakers pressured costs and reduced market share. New emissions and fuel economy standards required capital investment. Wage and price controls in the early 1970s, followed by high inflation, eroded real wages for many workers. Firms sought to reduce unit labor costs and increase flexibility. Management pressed for moderation in wage growth, adjustments to work rules, and productivity improvements. Unions defended cost of living adjustments and seniority rights, but accepted restructuring in some areas to improve competitiveness. Proposals were evaluated by their projected effects on unit cost, pricing, and demand. Executives maintained that wage restraint was necessary to protect profits and employment in a more competitive market. The shareholder primacy baseline shaped these arguments. The 1980s and early 1990s, restructuring, two-tier wages, and transplants. In 1979 to 1980, Chrysler required federal loan guarantees to avoid collapse. The rescue included significant union concessions and government oversight. During the 1980s, Japanese automakers opened assembly plants in the United States. These transplant factories used lean production methods and maintained lower unit labor costs. They were largely non-union during this period. Domestic automakers closed plants, reduced headcount, and negotiated cost reductions to regain competitiveness. Two-tier wage structures appeared in some agreements. Under these systems, new hires were paid less than incumbent workers for similar jobs, with slower progression to top rates. The practice lowered entry costs, but created disparities within the workforce. Companies justified the system as necessary to restore profitability and preserve domestic production. Unions accepted two-tier arrangements as temporary measures. Courts enforced contracts. They did not intervene in wage levels. The late 1990s to the 2010s, global competition, healthcare costs, and wage differentiation. Global competition intensified in the late 1990s and 2000s. Healthcare and pension costs increased. In 2007, the Detroit Three and the UAW negotiated agreements that created independent retiree healthcare trusts and expanded two-tier wage provisions to reduce labor costs for new hires. In 2008 to 2009, General Motors and Chrysler entered government-supervised restructurings during the financial crisis. Contracts were modified to reduce labor costs, suspend cost-of-living adjustments, and increase flexibility. Ford avoided bankruptcy due to earlier financing decisions, but pursued similar labor cost reductions to remain competitive. As demand recovered in the 2010s, agreements narrowed wage gaps and increased profit sharing. Profit-sharing formulas linked payouts to company performance. The logic of wage policy remained consistent. Firms paid more when profits permitted and restrained costs when margins were thin. Management framed wage decisions as business judgments aligned with long-term value. The language echoed the corporate purpose model articulated in 1919. The 2020s, tight labor markets, electrification, and renewed bargaining. In the early 2020s, supply chain disruptions, tight labor markets, and large investments in electrification changed wage dynamics. Workers pressed for restoration of cost-of-living adjustments and the narrowing of tiered pay structures. In 2023, the UAW conducted a coordinated strike against the three major domestic automakers. The resulting agreements included significant wage increases, reinstated cost-of-living adjustments, shorter progression times to top rates, and improvements in defined areas of job security and benefits. Companies accepted these terms within a context of strong profits from trucks and sport utility vehicles and the need to ensure labor stability during capital-intensive transitions to electric vehicles. Management presented the settlements as compatible with long-term plans. They emphasized affordability within current margins and the value of predictable operations. The shareholder primacy baseline remained in place. Wage increases were integrated where they supported strategic objectives and could be absorbed through productivity, pricing, or product mix. Assessment of causal pathways. It is necessary to distinguish direct effects from indirect frameworks. Dodge versus Ford did not set wages. It did not prohibit wage increases. Its concrete holding ordered a special dividend and declined to restrict expansion. Its durable influence came from a concise statement of corporate purpose. The opinion declared that the ordinary business corporation exists primarily to generate profit for its shareholders. Over time, this principle guided how managers justified wage policy. Under this baseline, higher wages were accepted when they reduced turnover, improved productivity, enhanced quality, or ensured labor peace. They were also accepted when required by law or bargaining outcomes that management judged to be in the firm's long-term interest. Wage restraint occurred when profitability was threatened by competition, regulation, or macroeconomic shocks. Courts did not evaluate the fairness of wage levels. They evaluated process and compliance with law. Public law and collective bargaining were the primary engines of wage gains and wage stability. The National Labor Relations Act, the Fair Labor Standards Act, and later civil rights and safety statutes set boundaries and created rights. Collective bargaining translated legal rights into specific wage and benefit packages. The corporate purpose baseline influenced the scope and interpretation of those packages within firms. It shaped the internal language of decision-making and the public language of justification. Long-term effects on wage patterns. Across a century, wage patterns in the automotive industry followed business cycles, competitive conditions, and legal frameworks. The $5 day of 1914 demonstrated that higher wages could support productivity when structured as business policy. The 1920s showed that wage policy under managerial control tended to follow demand and cost conditions, with welfare capitalism used to stabilize labor without unions. The 1930s and 1940s established collective bargaining and pattern agreements. The 1950s and 1960s linked real wage growth to productivity in a stable demand environment. The 1970s and 1980s introduced restraint and restructuring under competitive pressure. The 2000s and 2010s saw wage differentiation and later partial convergence under global competition and financial stress. The 2020s brought renewed increases during a transition to new technologies. In each period, managers used the language of shareholder interest to explain wage paths. Wage increases were justified as productive investments or as necessary to secure uninterrupted production. Concessions were justified as necessary to protect profits and jobs. Dodge versus Ford did not dictate these outcomes. It provided a clear standard of corporate purpose that allowed managers to present wage policy within a consistent framework. Conclusion: the 1919 decision in Dodge versus Ford Motor Company established a durable statement of corporate purpose. The court wrote that a business corporation is organized and carried on primarily for the profit of its shareholders. This principle did not set wages or regulate labor relations. It shaped the language and logic of managerial decision-making. For more than a century, wage policy in the automotive industry has been presented as a business choice guided by productivity, quality, risk, and profitability. Periods of wage growth coincided with strong demand and productivity gains. Periods of restraint coincided with competition, regulation, and macroeconomic stress. Public law and collective bargaining defined rights and processes. The corporate purpose baseline influenced how firms implemented those rights in wage and benefit decisions. The result is a marked continuity in corporate rationale from the 1920s to the present, in which employee wages are evaluated and justified through their contribution to the long-run health of the enterprise.